There are still no answers about how exactly Freddie Gray suffered the fatal spinal cord injury while in police custody. 6 officers have been suspended. That includes the 3 initial officers on bicycles, the driver of the transport van, and 2 other officers. NBC's Kurt Gregory has more.
They gather in churches.
We come to call on Him who is in charge of this whole universe and to ask Him that He would bless the city of Baltimore in a very critical hour.
And at City Hall in Baltimore, pressing for answers.
Justice for Freddie!
Following the death of Freddie Gray. The 25-year-old died Sunday, 1 week after suffering a severe spinal injury while in police custody. As protests continue, the governor of Maryland is sending a team of 32 state troopers to help with crowd control, promising to push for legislation for police body cameras.
I think having the real evidence of exactly what happened, having everything videotaped, is a step in the right direction.
The Department of Justice has launched an investigation into what happened, while the Baltimore Police Department continues its own.
Our officers, our task force, are interviewing witnesses to the event, and then when they're finding out things, they're going back and re-interviewing witnesses at the same time. And that just takes time.
I want peace. I do too. I want to be able to hug.
Peace and resolution that may only come when the investigations are complete.
Governor Hogan has asked the medical examiner's office to expedite Gray's autopsy report. Both the Justice Department and separately the Police Department are still investigating the incident. The calls for legislation for police body cameras are increasing. A prayer vigil for the city of Baltimore, the state of Maryland, and the family of Freddie Gray was held on Thursday.
We will be here to speak truth to the powers of this city that have the resources but lack the will to move Baltimore from 2 cities separate and unequal to 1 city in which all have the opportunity to grow and flourish.
Gray will be laid to rest on Monday. Joining me now is Paul Henderson, veteran prosecutor and legal analyst. Also, Dr. Peniel Joseph, professor of African American Studies at Tufts University, and Dr. James Peterson, MSNBC contributor and director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University. Mr. Henderson, let me turn to you first. The one thing Baltimore police has not addressed is why they chased Freddie Gray to begin with. How will this impact the investigation?
Well, we've heard from the attorney from the police union, which talked about citing case law that allows them to engage a suspect. And really, here's the problem. What they're referencing is a Supreme Court case. It's United States versus Jones, which talks about being able to engage an unprovoked suspect in a high crime area. But here's the problem with that. One, that speaks to reasonable suspicion to detain and not probable cause to arrest. And in this case, we have an arrest. So it's going to be very important that we understand if he did have a knife, when they did have the knife, if that was enough to arrest him, because knives aren't necessarily enough to arrest an individual per se. People are demanding for justice, people are demanding change, but they can't ask for any of those things until we get more information. And the other thing that I just want to point out very quickly is who defines a high crime area? Because in a densely populated city like Baltimore or Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, the entire city is considered a high crime area if you're just basing it on police reports where crimes have been committed. So really what we need is more information, and that's one of the reasons that people are so frustrated in this situation, because we're just not getting information from police reports, from autopsies, from any of the officials that are engaged in the investigation to the public.
All critical matters, to be sure. Dr. Joseph, The Guardian is reporting one arresting officer's alleged pattern of violence. We contacted the officer for a response. Representatives have not returned our call. Does this story matter in this case? Does it make a difference? Does it shade it in any way?
Well, no, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things we're seeing here, Doc, is mass surveillance leads to mass arrests, leads to mass incarceration, leads to mass violence and brutality and all these strings of killings that we're seeing of black women and men all throughout the country. The fact that this officer has a history, potentially, of physical brutality against citizens should be noted. But I think the larger framework right here, and why so many people are protesting, and we've seen these Black Lives Matter protests all across the country, is the fact that we have a criminal justice system that is not working for African Americans. The president, the White House task force, had 66 recommendations. Those were all well and good, and I've read that report, but they don't go far enough in terms of to stop the surveillance of these so-called high crime areas, which is really becoming, there's a police tourism industry right here, turning our neighborhoods into hunting grounds where on the notion of high crime, they're able to arrest, incarcerate, brutalize, and at times execute African Americans.
Wow, that's pretty dismal and pretty distressing, to be sure. Dr. Peterson, the Baltimore Police Union says they are concerned about the protest's tone. Is this the right consideration to have in the midst of the extraordinary catastrophe and chaos we see going on there?
Absolutely not. All Baltimore municipal officials should be focused on figuring out the ways in which to get their police forces to conduct themselves in a way that doesn't end up in the ending or the murder of black people. And in fact, police departments across this nation need to be taking that serious account. I take issue with folks who talk about protesters being peaceful when the issue for protesters is that law enforcement is murdering people. So if we're concerned about violence in our communities, we've got to direct it at the source of some of that violence. And as my colleagues on the panel have just talked about, unfortunately, this is too widespread right now. One of the things that's interesting to think about here, Doc, is, you know, the law enforcement is now in Baltimore is trying to say that maybe something happened in the vehicle. But Joy Reid on this network and other folk are starting to talk about the possibility of the actual fatal injury occurring prior to him being placed in the vehicle. And what we have to think about is what happened in the actual takedown. Was there some kind of cervical vertebrae fracture in the actual takedown that actually led to the paralysis? And I've been speaking to people on the ground there and speaking to medical professionals who say that sometimes when a law enforcement person puts a knee in the back or a knee on the neck, or like we saw in the Eric Harris video, a knee on someone's head, that can actually cause a cervical vertebrae fracture, where if you throw someone in a vehicle after that, the bone fragments can then sever their spine. So it may be that we need to get more evidence from law enforcement about how they took the person down, how they took Mr. Gray down, and what force was used there to really figure out what's going on here. And we have to keep our eyes on the prize in this sense, because the reality is we've seen way too many of these, and figuring out exactly what happened here will help us to better address these things going forward.
No question about it. Attorney Henderson, is it an irony involved here? This is the last day of service for the exiting Attorney General Eric Holder, who gave his goodbye speech today. Is there some great irony? We're still dealing with this even as Eric Holder is exiting and Loretta Lynch is coming in.
I don't look at it as irony, because the foundation that Mr. Holder has laid for us by trying to establish an example and a model for local law enforcement to follow with his 21st century policing is exactly being addressed in this situation here. And one of the things that the Attorney General has done was tour the country and talk with local jurisdictions about what models they should be following, those that addressed reducing racial profiling and eliminating bias and local policing. And so I don't think that Loretta Lynch, and I'm grateful that she has finally been confirmed, when she comes in, is going to change that agenda. And what I think is going to happen is that we will see a continuation of that model being spread around the rest of the country, specifically in Baltimore, as these independent investigations are going on, because again and again, we're seeing local law enforcement be challenged when there are incidents with outside independent review from state agencies and federal agencies, and it's very clear, at least from the federal level, what they expect of local law enforcement to address these situations that keep coming up again and again and involve interactions that end up in homicide with African American men and law enforcement. That just has to stop, and hopefully this is the conversation that moves this nation in that direction, again, with many of the other incidents that we've seen over the past few months and years.
Right. No question about that. Dr. Joseph, what's your reaction to the fact that there are more calls for the governor to get further involved?
Well, yeah, I think that the governor can get further involved, but I mean, obviously it's a Republican governor there in Maryland. I think one of the biggest things we need is policy right here. And there's too many interactions between the police and community members, and that has to do with the fact that police are incentivized through the war on drugs, through burn DOJ grants and other mechanisms to have this kind of interaction, to pump up their own stats. And the trail of violence that they're leaving behind, it really specifically targets poor African-American communities. Those of us who are middle, upper middle class, have access, we get targeted via racial profiling when we're in predominantly white settings usually. But predominantly African-American communities, like the one I grew up in, New York City, these communities and neighborhoods have become hunting grounds. And African-Americans right now are 28 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes than they were in 1982, the second year of the Reagan administration. Latinos 22 times more likely, and whites 8 times more likely. So the war on drugs has become a gateway to mass racial oppression. So Freddie Gray, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, all these victims are an example of a criminal justice system run amok. And certainly the governor should get involved. But the President of the United States, people have been calling on him before his term ends to sign an executive order ordering criminal justice review of the Byrne Grant, which is the largest criminal justice grant that goes to all these state and local governments. And it incentivizes black and brown women and men getting arrested instead of rehabilitation, instead of getting people out of jail and back in the community so we can have thriving neighborhoods and a thriving country with taxpayers, good citizens, good fathers and mothers and husbands and wives. Instead of that, we're incentivizing local police to use excessive force and brutality, and to, at times, it's leading to the death of African-American men and women.
How about that, Dr. Peterson, in light of what Dr. Joseph just indicated here? And he used twice the phrase hunting ground, which means that these people are vulnerable targets of state authority run amok. Do you think that the 6 officers who have been suspended should receive harsher punishment?
I mean, we have to figure out exactly what happened. I'm less a fan of trying to persecute the individual officers and much more interested in figuring out how we get the systemic changes that are required here. And Dr. Joseph is right. When you look at the conflation of mass incarceration, the sort of overly aggressive criminal justice system that we have, and the fact that it's biased and that it targets communities of color that are poor, the consequences of which are devastating in those communities, we have to figure out what are some of the systemic solutions. So yes, some of it's about addressing tactics and practices. Some of it's about rooting out the biases in these departments. But some of it's also about the movement understanding that this is broader than what these individual male cases that rise to the top are. Or not enough of us are talking about Rakia Boyd, right, who was shot sort of in a crossfire, right? And this is a lot of us, not enough of us are talking about Natasha McKinney, who died in police custody under awful circumstances. We have to expand the sort of sense within which we are talking about these issues so that we can capture all the things that are actually going on to get the data to understand how to best address it going forward.
That's right, because if all black lives don't matter, no black lives matter. So we have to take into account issues of gender and certainly issues of community and class as they figure out in who we think are worthy victims whose plights and predicaments are to be addressed. Paul Henderson, Peniel Joseph, and James Peterson, thank you so much for your time tonight. Coming up, Adam Sandler's new movie sparks outrage over its cultural insensitivity towards Native Americans. We'll have the details ahead. And later, Louisiana's religious freedom law gets a big boost of support from its governor. The Rapid Response Panel takes on the latest attack on gay rights. Stay tuned.